We start with the war in Iran and the ceasefire announced this week, with negotiations taking place in Pakistan, led by Vice President Vance. Ambassador Richard Haass served as a diplomat in both Republican and Democratic administrations before leading the Council on Foreign Relations for 2 decades. He now is with Centerview Partners. Richard, you have been in the room, as it were, for some very high-level negotiations. Give us a guide to how we should look at the negotiations going on right now involving the war in Iran.
Well, the beginning of negotiations tends to be throat clearing, in my experience, that people are often posturing, getting comfortable. The fact that, in particular, the U.S. side is so inexperienced. You've got 2 non-diplomats who have been the principal diplomats for the United States, and then you've got the vice president who doesn't have a long background. Plus, David, the 2 sides, shall we say, to say they're far apart would be a diplomatic understatement. They are, someone pointed out, it's wider than the Strait of Hormuz, the differences between the 2 sides. And the question is, to what extent are they willing and able, are they prepared essentially to begin to bridge the differences? So this is a tall order, plus one more thing. It's taking place against the backdrop, shall we say, of something other than a ceasefire. This is already a messy situation. It's not war, but it's not peace or even a pause. It's something in between, which again complicates the task.
As a diplomat, how do you start breaking down that gap, as you describe it? I mean, people have said in a Venn diagram, there's no overlap right now in the position of the 2 sides.
Well, the first thing is, before you start thinking about what you're going to try to accomplish across the table, you need to have in your own mind, say, let's talk about the U.S. side. What are its priorities? You've got the nuclear issue, you've got the Strait, you've got ceasefire, you've got Iranian support for proxies, you've got Iranian drone and ballistic missile development, you've got internal Iranian treatment of its own people. It's a long list. So one thing is to think about, what are our priorities? Where also are our opportunities? Where do we think potentially there's some give on the other side, or the gap between the 2 sides is not going to be the same in each one of the things I just mentioned. It might be bigger in some of the others. Where are we prepared to compromise?
What does the United States have to come out of this with in terms of the Strait of Hormuz, which wasn't even an issue going in?
Yeah, I think the 2 biggest issues are the Strait of Hormuz and the nuclear. The Strait of Hormuz is the more time-urgent issue, because every day that goes by is disastrous for the international economy and for the region. The nuclear issue can be parked for a while, not because it's not important, but unless there's evidence that Iran is changing the status of nuclear materials or its program, then nothing changes. So I would say Strait of Hormuz is the big issue. What we cannot allow is for Iran to exercise sole control over the Strait, charging tolls where it derives all the revenues, because that would also eliminate any economic pressure on the Iranian regime. What I've argued is we ought to adopt the principle that the Strait of Hormuz needs to be open for all or closed to all, including Iran. And what I've recommended with two of my colleagues, Neil Ferguson and Phil Zelikow, is that we create a new Strait of Hormuz commission or authority that would essentially govern the operation of the Strait. Perhaps you could have a fee charge, but then it would be distributed, not just to Iran, but to the other, half dozen or so local countries. Might be some degree of enforcement or support from the countries in Europe and Asia that are most dependent on the passage through the Strait. I would bring China into the equation, because it has influence, obviously, in Iran. But we need some type of a governing authority that dilutes Iran's ability to decide who gets to use the Strait. And if we can't get that, David, I would favor a blockade. Again, open for all or closed to all, including Iran, and a blockade option in the Gulf of Oman.
Even if you get to a governing authority that we all agree to, it sounds like Iran's going to have a say. They're going to have a seat at the table.
100%.
It's not clear they had that before. Is that really a step backward? Because it used to be an international waterway.
You're right. And there's no return, though, to the status quo ante. I think Iran has discovered that it has more leverage than it ever quite realized before. I don't think we can walk this back. So we're going to have to bring them in. So yeah, we're going to end up here and elsewhere, probably worse off than we were 5-6 weeks ago. What we want to do, though, is limit the scale of that. And I think, again, probably the wisest course here is not to do something to Iran, but to do something with Iran, to give Iran a stake in an open Strait of Hormuz, and I think we have a chance to achieve that, but probably only if we have the pressure of saying, you either agree to something reasonable, and again, try to get the Chinese and others to help us here, or we're going to make it impossible for you to benefit from the Strait of Hormuz. So I think that gives us a little bit of leverage. Also, Iran's economy is really hurting, David. Iran was in terrible shape before this war. It's in worse shape now. So yes, they have some leverage, obviously, given some of the things they've done, but I think we would be wrong to ignore the degree to which we also enjoy a degree of leverage here.
Well, I wonder about the leverage going into this, because looking at what the military has done in Iran, you'd say, boy, the United States has an awful lot of leverage with Israel as well. Is it the case that the United States has the upper hand going into this, or is the mere fact that Iran has survived and can still do damage despite all we've done, does it actually give leverage to Iran?
Iran emerges from this with considerable leverage. It's so interesting that you can, quote unquote, win a war in the classic battlefield sense, but lose a war in the political leverage, strategic sense. And that's what I would argue is happening here. The United States and Israel, by normal measures of warfare, have done extremely well. But strategically, politically, Iran has emerged with far more leverage than it had before.
We in the United States have a tendency to look at it as United States versus Iran. There is another player. As you've pointed out in your newsletter, Home and Away, you've pointed out Israel has been a significant factor, including perhaps in getting the war started in the first place. How do you deal with that as a diplomat when you've got Bibi Netanyahu and Israel having a say?
I think now, David, we probably have to accept the awkward reality that American and Israeli interests here are diverging. What Israel's been doing in Lebanon recently, I would argue, is not necessary. It's certainly not a priority for us at this point. So I'll be blunt. President, there's this thing called the telephone. President ought to pick it up, get on the phone with Prime Minister Netanyahu and say, stop. The argument for continuing the war is not nearly as strong as the argument for a ceasefire and these peace talks. Your vital national interests are not at stake. Iran is not doing anything new, say with its nuclear program, that would pose an existential threat to you. What you're doing in Lebanon is discretionary, not essential. Knock it off. And I think that's important. And I worry, David. I think actually one of the losers in this war is the U.S.-Israeli relationship. This was a relationship already under pressure because of what had happened in Gaza over the last few years. And I worry that by overreaching here, the Israeli government may have contributed to a further deterioration in the U.S.-Israeli relationship, which I would argue is in the interest of neither country.
Your role at Centerview Partners now has you consulting with large corporations, with CEOs, about business and economics. What does it mean for them? What are you advising them of what this means over the longer term?
I'd say two things. I have a long list, but let me highlight two things. One is it's a little bit difficult to see how this part of the world rebounds completely. There was the business model of the Gulf, of the, if you will, Dubai, let's use that as a shorthand. Tax havens, stability, great economic opportunity, energy, data centers. A little bit hard now to imagine the same scale of investment. If I told you your multi-billion-dollar investment would require 10 years of stability to pay off, you might think twice before opening up your checkbook to do that. That's one thing. I think people have to think a little bit differently. Second of all, rethink the whole notion of economic and energy security. Much more diversification, less emphasis on one geography, less emphasis on one form of energy, and so forth. I think corporations in this country and the rest of the world have to assume that the sort of thing we just saw here is not a one-off. It's not something that couldn't happen again here or in other parts of the world.
And finally, what are the chances of a true resolution of this situation, which was going on for almost 50 years now, as opposed to sort of monitoring and managing a chronic problem where we're going back and forth over years?
At the risk of depressing your viewers even further, David, I don't think you get a resolution absent a fundamental change in the political system in Iran, and unfortunately I don't see that in the cards anytime soon. Maybe down the road against the backdrop of further economic problems, but right now this regime is, if anything, more entrenched than it was 5-6 weeks ago. So then you say, okay, we're not going to solve the problem. We're managing it, so we come up with some mechanism maybe to manage passage through the Strait of Hormuz, not perfect. Maybe we come up with some negotiated or non-negotiated, maybe just red lines and implicit signals about how we put a ceiling on Iran's nuclear program. I don't know about their support for proxies. They're going to continue to build drones. Every basement is a would-be factory when it comes to drones. Look what Ukraine has done. So I think your word management is the right word. You know, too many people look at things as problems to be solved. Let me just suggest, if we're lucky, this is a situation, this is a condition that we will be able to manage.